So neat things are happening, and we're excited about that. And we just, we thank God for every church planting expression that's happening around the world, and all the neat things that we see groups. Of course, Hillsong C3, and there's other great groups there in the States that are planting some cool churches. But we enjoy what we do, and it's a thrill. So on behalf of Pastor Greg and the lead team, we're grateful to be here. I want to talk for a few minutes and drill down on the idea. I believe it encapsulates not only church planting, but also planting campuses, and like we talked about before, opening up new avenues of ministry. And I want to talk for a few minutes about reproducing ourselves, or building or the church, where you raise up next generational leaders. How do you raise up next generational leaders? How do you raise up church planters, or those that can maybe lead a campus, or those that can raise up and do ministry? How do you reproduce yourself, and how do you raise up those things as it relates to church planters or just great staff people? And one of the chapters in the Bible, I think, speaks so much of transitioning and being able to relay what we do is Psalm 78. Psalm 78 is a great chapter as it relates to passing things to generations, trusting generations, the love of being able to have an eye on the future, but a great honor for the present and a great respect for what the past that we've had. We always are looking to the future. We're more committed to the future than we are our past, but we honor our past. We thank God for our now, but we also are looking to what's next for us. And how do you do that in the blending of generations and the blending of those that are a part of it? And it just says things. I love some of these verses where it gets into verse 4. We will not hide them from our children, telling to the generations to come the praises of God. It goes down and it speaks in verse 5 of Psalm 78 that we establish a testimony in Jacob, but then also we appoint it in the law of Israel, which we command to our fathers, which then they command and they commit to their children. Verse 6, that the generation to come might know, the children who will be born or who are born. So it speaks of children and generations. And about every other verse for about 8 or 9 verses, it speaks of children and generations and fathers and children and generations and fathers. And I love that, because I think as leaders, we have to be multi-generational as it relates to our values. And we value the different generations, and we learn to appreciate them, and we learn to give them place. I wrote this down, that God doesn't have a favorite age group. Can I have a good amen? I know the young people think that he loves them, but he loves the senior adults, and he loves the married. He loves the single. He loves the single again. He loves those that are widows. He loves those that are children. So he doesn't have a favorite age group, even though the age group that we're in, we feel like is the favorite one. Now, that's the best one. That's the wisest one. And we have to understand that God is multi-generation, that God embraces those generations, and that he's able to help us understand the relays that have to happen at every generation as it relates to leadership and reproducing, and how do we grow what we're doing within the generations, and how do we appreciate that with the generations. I know that we teach that a lot to our church planters, because a lot of our church planters are either coming out of student ministry, they're coming out of some type of college expression, they're coming out of a young adult ministry. A lot of them are coming out of a worship background, where so often in a lot of settings now, worship is in about a decade of an age group, maybe a decade and a half, but it's kind of stuck into there. So we're teaching church planters, you've got to be able to build a church. Yes, you're your age. Yes, you're your flow, but you've got to be able to embrace all ages, because it's going to take all ages and all different expressions if you're going to build a healthy, sustainable church that you can reproduce. So how do you do those things, and how do you bring those things together? I wrote this down. I remember being the youngest in the room, and that had an awesome feeling. I can remember going to meetings, and I was like, yeah, I'm 28. Sorry, just one of the young guys. I remember being the youngest church planter in the season we planted our church that I knew of. There were some guys in California, which they were doing stuff with a group back in those days. I think they were navigators. They were based out of California. So they were planting some churches. There were some vineyard guys planting churches. But we didn't know any of those in the South where we lived. And so I remember being the youngest church planter that I knew. And I grew up in a pretty cool network where you knew some people. And then I remember when it shifted, and then you were kind of like the same age, and you had that fraternity or that group of just, we're kind of all the same age. And I remember when young youth pastors started calling me and saying, hey, I thought I was going to be a youth pastor forever, but I think I want to plant a church. And we started planning all of our friends. And I can remember a season in about a 5 or 6 year window when probably 30 of my friends planted a church. That was a great time. Man, a lot of our good friends, Stovall Weems and John Siebling and Matt was, all the guys, we started getting to know each other, Rob Ketterling, we're all knowing, we're planting, and we were all kind of the same age, which is amazing. What I love now is so often dealing with church planters and guys that were planting. So often now I'm the senior in the room. I'm the big brother. I'm the dad that's in the room. And I love that we've got some young guys in ARC that are doing tremendous thing. There's a guy in Chattanooga, Tavner Smith. He's planted, and so far, he's the most aggressive in attendance church that's ever been planted in ARC. 541 churches. He's 3 times as large as where Church of the Highlands was at their date. I mean, he's running 1,800. He's about 20 months old. How many knows that's nauseating, if you know what I'm talking about? I mean, I can think of Dave Summerall. I was at his church, and I want to say he's probably 5 or 6 years old, John, and running 3,000 or 4,000 people now. Just these young guys, and you're around these guys, and you're navigating it. Michael spends a lot of time with them, where they're going further, and they're going quicker, and there's an accelerated pass. And you end up being an older brother or a dad, and the majority of my time now is what I'm realizing is I'm growing fruit on other people's trees. So there comes a time in your life where you begin to transition, and it's all about your tree, and it's all about your fruit. And you love having your fruit show and your tree show. But there comes a time where you begin to realize, and I don't think that's an age, I believe that's a stage in your life where you realize, hey, maybe the way to build the kingdom and maybe the way that we really establish a testimony for Christ is that I begin to do all I can to see great fruit grow on other people's trees. Matter of fact, some of my greatest fruit that I'll ever be a part of will not grow on my tree. That's a transition in leadership. It's a transition of where you're at. So thinking about those things where all of a sudden now you're giving values and you're leading the next generation and you're leading them so that they lead well. So I want to give you for a few minutes before we do a Q&A. And I love Q&A. And I think it's a good time. We'll have the others involved, but then, the different stages of I love what I'm doing now because I led a church for 20 years. Now I'm leading an organization, but I'm on staff at a church. So there was a time I sat at the head of the table. Now I sit at the side of the table. And so it's been an interesting dynamic of learning 2 different ways to do things. But in all of them, the passion has to be, how do we raise up and reproduce leaders in the next generation? And how do you get to the point where that happens? So I'm going to give you 7 things, values of leading the next generation, or reproducing yourself, or raising up church planters. Whatever your context is, I believe some of these things can help you. Here's the first thing. It takes time. Can I have an amen? It takes time. My wife, over the last probably 5 years, we have a thing that we use at our home. It's like a slow cooker. We call it a crock pot. Do you call that here in the Netherlands a crock pot? Slow cooker. And it is awesome. And we use it a lot now. And so she makes an Italian, I'm Italian, she makes an Italian style roast beef roast. It's Italian. And she puts it on early in the morning. All throughout the day, you smell it. And when you smell it, Michael Murphy, you want to partake. But it's not time yet. So I'll go around, I'll start, don't open it. Don't open that. Don't get your hands in that. Go in the other room. But the smell tells me it's ready. Oh, come on, somebody. So often, the smell, the aura, the essence, you think it's ready. But wisdom says, needs a little more time. Needs a little more time. And so it takes time. I wrote this down. Length of investment always determines length of return. Length of investment Are you willing to invest over a long time? I remember my first pastor. I was 22 years old, 21 years old, and I was on a team, and he, I'll tell you a couple stories. He would bring me in and would sit me in the corner. He had a very large office. And he would go and he would call me and he'd say, listen, I need you in my office at 1:45. And I'd run down at 1:45. He'd say, sit in that chair over against that bookcase. And I'd sit in that chair and I'd sit there. He'd be working at his desk. Pastor Michael just working at his desk. And I'd just sit there. About 45 minutes later, he'd get up, wouldn't even speak to me. No coffee, no water. Just sit there watching him. He'd say, study me. He's at his desk. And then it was a very large church. And then he'd get up and there'd be a couple that come into counseling. And it'd say, hey, good, sit down. Don't pay any attention to him. Ignore him. And then he would counsel. Would deal with issues, pain, tragedies, debate, argument, leadership. And I would sit in that corner. And he did that for me every month. And I don't know how often when I planted that church, I was sitting with a couple and I began to mimic what he said. It took time. And how important that is to take time. We've got to give time. Sometimes it's a phone call. There's about 30 guys that I call about every 2 weeks on the phone. Don't text them. I call them on the phone. 2 of them communicated to me this week. Kyle Turner in Kansas City, who's doing a great church. He was at the college there, Hillsong College. He broke 1,300 this Sunday. We called on the phone. What was that like? Tell me what that was like. God, the place had to be packed. I didn't tell him what we had at Highlands because that's not important. Tell me, wow, 13, that is huge. That is massive. Josh Turner in Orlando, who planted a church out of Stovall Weems, broke 1,100 this Sunday. Oh my gosh, what was that like? Tell me what you felt like. Oh, that's amazing. That's amazing. What is it? It takes time to raise up the next generation. You give them time. You communicate. I remember in my younger days getting on a plane and flying across the world. I remember flying one time across the globe to spend 1 hour with Brian Houston. Flew all the way to Australia, went to his home, sat down in his home, and we talked. I left, spent the night, got on the plane, and flew back to the States. I remember flying, just to go sit and have lunch with Rick Warren. Flying to go I remember flying one time, walking Joyce Myers to her van to ask one question. Time. Do you have time for someone to just ask a question? Spend an hour with you. It takes time to raise up the next generation. And as young people, you've got to be willing. If you say, well, I'm 20 or 30, you've got to be willing to fly around the world to sit an hour with someone. It takes time. A few more we'll do is, I wrote the word taste. I think you've got to let young leaders taste responsibility. I believe eventually they have to taste responsibility. Being able to taste it. I remember one time going into a banking meeting and I grabbed one of our key guys, said, just sitting the meeting, I'm going to deal with bankers. You just need to learn what it feels like to deal with bankers. So taste responsibility. Another one is, I think one of the ways you raise up the next generation and reproduce leaders is through transparency. I think you've got to tell them your pain. You've got to give them 100% of life. I think every young leader needs a safe place to talk about his struggles. So one of the ways that we reproduce ourselves is through transparency. You saw Matt and Martha being transparent up here. There was a transparency. What is it? Our strengths maybe impress people, but our weaknesses connect people. So if I'm going to connect with you, the only way I'm really going to be able to connect with you is I'm going to tell you my weakness. It's interesting when you get together with a group of pastors, normally after everybody celebrates the win, which normally is about 10 minutes. Hey, how many did you have Sunday? What was your attendance? Blah, blah, blah. I want to tell me, I heard you had to fire somebody. Awesome. Tell me about it. Hey man, I heard somebody stole your van with all your equipment. Let's talk about it. It's like there's therapy in the pain, Let's talk about the problem. Tell me about your worst day. I don't know how many times when we sit around with pastors, normally we have chit-chatty little talk, and then we say, hey God, tell me about your worst day. Oh man, that's awesome. It's like you're living vicariously through somebody else's pain, which makes you feel better. And so there's got to be a transparency. Here's a fourth thing is trials. If you're going to raise up the next generation, if we're going to reproduce leaders, if we're going to find a church planter, I think I wrote this down. You got to give ministry in trial sizes. Got to give them a trial size. You know, you have a little trial size. Go to the hotel, get a little trial size of shampoo. Got to give them a little trial size. Let them try something. Let them do something. I remember one Sunday I had an idea. I said, I'm going to let all of our young guys do the invitation time. We had 5 services, and everybody got to do invitation. 4 of them bombed. Horrible. I mean, like, nobody got saved. Like, nobody, you couldn't even get saved. It's like, you couldn't even find it. And so I preached, and then I gave it to them to the invitation. But let me tell you something. I found one. Brother hit it out of the park. I mean, I was like, whoa. And you know what's amazing? He's planning a church in San Francisco next year. We just had to give a little trial sizes. So you're going to raise and produce leaders. You got to give them a trial size. They've got to be able to go through trials. So time, taste, transparency, trials. And then the 5th one is trust, I believe. Trust. That goes both ways. You got to be able to, you got to be able to course correct people. Oversight. And then you say, well, tell me about that. Ask good questions. One of the things that Pastor Chris does so well is ask good questions. You want to ask people good questions. Well, why did you do it that way? Tell me what you learned about that. Would you do it differently? I think one of the best ways to raise up a church planter is to be able to ask them great questions. One of the great ways to reproduce leaders is asking great questions, where you can all of a sudden the things. If this is ministry, and you've been touching it 8 times to lead it, then you've got to hand it to somebody else. I'm only going to touch it 8 times, or 6 times. You've now got to touch it twice, and then all of a sudden now I'm going to touch it 4 times. You need to touch it 4 times. Okay, now I'm going to touch it 2 times. You're going to touch it 6 times. Okay, guess what? I'm not going to touch it anymore. I think that's how you reproduce leaders. Whatever I'm touching a lot, I want to touch less. Now you're going to do that. And gradually they begin to, I've been setting the worship set. I'm not going to set the worship set anymore. I'm just going to look at it 1 time. You're going to look at it 5 times. Okay, so there's ways that you can do that. Does that make sense? I think it's one of the ways you reproduce leaders. You touch things less. And then number 6 is try and try again. You got to let people try things and try again. Let them succeed. Let them fail. Pick up, learn, go on. What did you learn from that? What did you learn from that situation? How would you do it differently? So you have to try things. Let them try things. Let them try things and fail. And then you go back, and we tried something the other day in an ARC setting, and he hit about, we had probably 6 marks we needed to hit, and he hit about 3 of them. And so probably days ago, I would probably approach it differently. I celebrated the 3 he hit a little more than I used to. So I was probably 70% on the 3 he hit, 30% on the 3 he missed. Probably younger days, I would have been 70% on the 3 he missed, and probably 10% on what he did good, and 20% all about me. Let me tell you how I'll do it. Let's take a moment to talk about me. And so what happens in reproducing leaders and raising the conversation has to be less and less about you, and has to be more and more about them and helping them. So does that make sense? Does that help you? And then the last thing I wrote, which I think is so important, is transitions. Learning how to do transitions. So eventually there's a ministry that you're leading that now they're going to lead, and you now are going to be a little bit anonymous. Come on. Michael and I can tell you a little bit about that. Pastor Michael and I can tell you about raising up ministries that 3 years later you go back to it and half the people don't know who you are. And you were the founder of that ministry. You started that ministry, and you walk in, they give you a visitor packet. They no longer even give you your mail that comes there. They throw your mail away. It's like, okay, thanks a lot. I mean, I did give my life and bleed all over this place, and now you don't even know who I am. So being able, if you're going to reproduce leaders, not only are you helping them transition, you have to be willing to transition. And I think Craig Rochelle said it great. Anytime you give away ministry, you've got to deal with your own internal disorientation. So you've got to be willing yourself to have some internal disorientation that I no longer am the point person of this thing. Yes, it's the value, and we, of course, we provide leadership, we provide vision, we provide boundaries, and we provide budget, and we provide certain things. But there comes a time where you realize that they are leading that. They are leading that. They are doing that. And you've got to be okay in that insecurity zone of letting them lead. We're not talking about internal, I'm the boss and you're accountable and you're honoring and we understand spiritual govern issues. We're not talking about those things. I'm talking about the reality of reproducing yourself when someone does something that you are doing or they're now doing ministry, or you've planted them as a church, or you've sent them out. There's a transition where you're able to let go and let them flourish and let them lead and realize those things where, wow, that's awesome. I can remember my father-in-law told me this little story. He said he remembers going fishing with a man, and he was throwing the rod out, and his son was throwing the rod out, and he hooked a fish. And he said he remembered that dad snatching the rod out of the son's hand and said, you can't get it in the boat, I'll get it in the boat. And I remember my father-in-law, who was very young at the time, said, if I ever have a son, I would be willing to let him try to get it in the boat. I'd rather him lose the fish getting it in the boat than me get it in the boat. Because he needs to feel the thrill of the catch and the tug and the wrestle. And even if he doesn't get it in the boat, it was a bigger win that he felt it. And he said, I don't want to be the dad that takes the reel out and says, I don't trust you. You're not good enough. Here, I'm the only one that can get the fish in the boat. And we got great leaders who do that. Brian Houston does that. Other great leaders, they do that. Greg Surratt does that. Matt and Mark. It's just the greater thrill is me watching someone else get the fish in the boat. And then when it comes time for a picture, hey, so you cut me off. So you only got half of me. The real important thing was you and the fish. Help us to be spiritual big brothers, because I think every one of you in here can be a spiritual big brother. But then transition to be a spiritual father. That's another whole level. So I'm going to end with this last question. End with a question. I think it's up on the screen. Okay. How am I doing in raising up the next ... So just take a moment and answer that question. How am I doing raising up the next campus pastor, the next worship leader, the next church planter? How am I doing in raising up the next person who's going to oversee small groups? The next person who's really going to take our student ministry and our what we're doing, in our city campus or whatever that may be. How am I doing in raising up the next? That is a question that we have to ask ourselves. I really believe about every other week. But if we're going to move into being big brothers and being spiritual fathers and being what we really feel like God wants us to be, that's a question that has to be on the rotation. It's a rotational question in what we're doing and building what we're doing. And I just think that'll help us be great leaders. Amen.